Imagine a jaw that glows in the dark. Not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech pulled from some gothic horror novel written to frighten children into sleep. Literally, a human jawbone, still seated inside a living face, emitting a cold, pale, greenish light in the darkness of a room. Now imagine that same jaw crumbling. Not quickly, not mercifully, slowly, over months, over years. The bone softening from the inside, turning spongy where it should be dense, collapsing where it should hold. Teeth loosening without warning, falling out one by one into trembling hands that once painted flowers and earned a decent wage. The jaw itself eroding, not from disease, not from injury, not from anything the doctors of the era had ever witnessed in a living patient, simply dissolving, as though something inside the bone was consuming it from within. The abscesses came first, usually. A tenderness in the gum, a small swelling. Then the swelling would open, and what drained from it was not the ordinary matter of infection. It was something else. Something that defied the era's understanding of human physiology. And in the darkened rooms where doctors leaned low over these suffering women, something impossible revealed itself. The wounds glowed. The very breath of some of these women, exhaled into a darkened space, carried a faint
luminescence. Their saliva, their blood, their bones, exposed by the collapse of surrounding tissue, shone with a dim and ghostly light that had no place inside a human being. These were not women from mythology. They were not literary creations conjured to illustrate some dark allegory. They were real. They had names. They had mothers and sisters and dance cards and small savings put away in envelopes. They were workers. Young mostly. Some barely out of childhood. And the thing that was killing them, the thing that made them glow, had been painted on with their own hands, shaped to a fine point by their own lips, dozens of times each day. They had been told it was harmless. They had been told, in fact, that it was good for them. To understand how something like this could happen, you have to understand what the world believed about radium in the years just after the First World War. The word miracle is overused. It is deployed casually, stripped of meaning by repetition. But in the 1910s and 1920s, radium was a miracle, in the fullest and most earnest sense of the word that secular science could offer. It was the most extraordinary substance ever isolated by human hands. It was discovered by Marie Curie, whose work had already redrawn the boundaries of what physics and chemistry were understood to be.
Radium did not behave like other elements. It glowed. It produced heat spontaneously, seemingly without consuming any fuel. It could kill cancerous tumors. It destroyed diseased tissue, while proponents claimed leaving healthy tissue largely unharmed. This was, by the standards of 1920, nothing short of miraculous.
The popular press ran stories about radium that read like dispatches from the future. Patent medicines laced with radium were sold in pharmacies and advertised as tonics that would restore vitality, improve digestion, sharpen the mind, and extend life. Wealthy men drank water filtered through radium-bearing ore from ceramic pots marketed under names that promised rejuvenation. Cosmetics brands added trace amounts of radium to face creams. Chocolate laced with radium powder was sold as a health confection. The glow was not a warning sign to the people of that era. The glow was the appeal. The glow was proof that something extraordinary was at work. Radium
in the cultural imagination of the 1920s was life itself made visible. And so, when the United States
Radium Corporation, operating out of plants in Orange and Newark, New Jersey, and later in Ottawa, Illinois, began hiring young women to paint luminous numbers onto watch dials, there was no fear in the factory. There was no dread settling into the lungs with the fine, pale dust that drifted through the workrooms. There was pride. There was camaraderie. There was, among many of the girls, a kind of delight. They were paid well by the standards available to young working-class women at the time. They were part of something modern and important. The watches and instruments they painted kept accurate time in darkness, guided pilots, and allowed soldiers to read their instruments in the black of night. Their work was, in a real and concrete sense, connected to the safety of men in the sky and in the field. It mattered. They mattered. The paint they worked with was called Undark. It was a mixture of radium powder, zinc sulfide, and adhesive, and it glowed with that same beautiful, impossible, dangerous light. When the young women left the factory at the end of a shift, their hair and clothing and skin would shimmer faintly in the dark. They would stop in front of mirrors and watch themselves glow. Some would paint their nails with it for fun. Some would paint their teeth, then grin at their friends in darkened rooms to make them laugh. One young woman painted her face with it and surprised her date. Arriving at the door in the darkness, her features outlined in cold green fire. It was beautiful. They thought it was beautiful. And the supervisors knew. Some of them, in positions high enough to understand what was happening beneath the surface of the science. They knew that beauty was a lure. They knew, or came to know, what the glow actually meant. And they said nothing. The technique was called lip dip paint. The brushes used to apply undark to the minute numerals of watch faces were fine, camel hair, capable of producing lines barely a millimeter wide. But the bristles spread with use. They lost their point. And rather than provide tools to reshape them, tools that would have kept the radium out of the workers' mouths, the factory supervisors instructed the girls to use their lips, to place the brush between their lips and draw it to a fine point with the gentle, automatic pressure of the mouth. Then dip into the luminous paint. Then apply to the dial face. Then repeat. Lip, dip, paint. Dozens of times per hour. Hundreds of times per day. Thousands of times per week. For months. For years. Each time a dial painter drew that brush between her lips, she ingested a small quantity of radium. Each time she exhaled in that workroom filled with glowing dust, she breathed particles of it back in. It settled in her hair, on her skin, in the fine membranes of her nose and throat. It entered her bloodstream through the walls of her digestive tract. And once inside the blood, radium did something that made it uniquely, specifically, catastrophically lethal. The human body could not tell the difference between radium and calcium. This is the core of the horror. Not the malice, not the negligence. Those came later.
And we will reach them. But this, the chemical masquerade, the body, encountering radium in the blood, processed it the way it processed calcium. And calcium belongs in bone. So the body dutifully carried the radium to the skeleton and deposited it there, locked it into the matrix of the bones, concentrated it precisely in the most calcium-dense tissues in the body, the jaw, the skull, the vertebrae, the long bones of the arms and legs. And there it stayed,
Radium does not decay quickly. Its half-life is 1,600 years. It does not become inert after a season, or a year, or a decade. It remains, and it emits continuously from within the bone. Alpha radiation, tearing through the surrounding tissue in doses that the external environment could never deliver so intimately, because the source was not outside the body. The source was inside the bone itself. It was irradiating the marrow. It was irradiating the blood being manufactured inside the marrow. It was irradiating every adjacent structure from a distance of 0. There is no shielding against a radiation source that lives inside you. The bone, subjected to this continuous internal bombardment, began to respond the way bone responds
to damage. It attempted to repair itself. Abnormal growths appeared. Tumors of the bone, osteosarcomas, began forming in jaws and skulls and femurs. At the same time, the radiation was destroying the blood-forming tissue in the marrow, leading to aplastic anemia, the catastrophic failure of the body's ability to produce healthy blood. The immune system, deprived of its cellular components, collapsed. Infections moved in unopposed. Alpha radiation, tearing through the surrounding tissue in doses that the external environment could never deliver so intimately, because the source was not outside the body. The source was inside the bone itself. It was irradiating the marrow. It was irradiating the blood being manufactured inside the marrow. It was irradiating every adjacent structure from a distance of 0. There is no shielding against a radiation source that lives inside you. The bone, subjected to this continuous internal bombardment, began to respond the way bone responds to damage. It attempted to repair itself. Abnormal growths appeared. Tumors of the bone, osteosarcomas, began forming in jaws and skulls and femurs. At the same time, the radiation was destroying the blood-forming tissue in the marrow, leading to aplastic anemia, the catastrophic failure of the body's ability to produce healthy blood. The immune system, deprived of its cellular components, collapsed. Infections moved in unopposed. The jaw was often the first visible site of catastrophe, because it received among the heaviest depositions of radium, and so the jaw bore witness first. Dentists who examined these women in the early stages were baffled. The teeth would loosen without obvious cause. The gums would not heal after routine extractions. The bone beneath would fail to close over. Abscesses would form in the empty sockets and resist every treatment. And then, in some cases, something far worse. The jawbone itself would begin to die, section by section, progressing through tissue that should have been vital and functional, leaving regions of dead, crumbling bone inside a living face. Surgeons, in attempting to address the damage, found that jaw sections would come away with horrifying ease. There are accounts of physicians removing portions of mandible that had essentially become necrotic rubble, no longer connected to the living architecture of the face. There are accounts of women whose entire lower jaws were eventually removed in attempts to control the infection and the decay. And still, in the darkened examination rooms, the wounds glowed. The women, by the time this was happening to them, were in their 20s. Some were younger. They had spent their healthiest years in that factory, doing precise and careful work, proud of their skill and their income. And now their faces were consuming themselves. Amelia Maggio was one of the first. She had worked at the Orange, New Jersey plant. She was young, capable, and by all accounts, unremarkable. Filled with ordinary texture, the small routines and relationships that constitute a human existence. She began losing teeth in 1920. Her jaw became infected. Her
Her dentist extracted what teeth remained and attempted to manage what he assumed was a conventional dental abscess. It did not resolve. The bone began to die. Her jaw was eventually removed in pieces. The infection spread to her skull. She died in September of 1922, officially of syphilis, a diagnosis that was not only incorrect, but had been recorded, it would later be alleged, with the cooperation of physicians connected to the company's interests. She was 24 years old. Her death was the beginning of a pattern, though no one outside the factory's inner administrative circles was yet reading it as one. In the years that followed, more women from the same workrooms began presenting with the same constellation of symptoms: the jaw infections, the loosening teeth, the anemia, the bone pain, the fatigue that settled over them like a gradual drowning. A doctor named Barry examined several of them. He found evidence that pointed clearly toward radium poisoning, and the United States Radium Corporation was made aware of his conclusions. They responded by hiring their own physicians, their own experts, men who would examine the sick workers and return verdicts of syphilis, of anemia of unspecified origin, of tuberculosis, of causes that were real diseases and therefore plausible, and above all, unconnected to the factory and the paint and the brushes the women had drawn between their lips 10,000 times. The company's vice president, Arthur Roeder, brought in a doctor named Frederick Flynn from Columbia University. Flynn examined the workers. He published findings that declared them to be in adequate health. He positioned himself as an independent physician offering objective conclusions. He did not disclose that the United States Radium Corporation was paying him.
The women were not told what the doctors had found. They were not told what the company's own internal investigations had begun to reveal. Some were told they were simply run down. Some were told that their symptoms were personal and unrelated to work. Some were told, directly to their faces, while their bones were dissolving, that there was nothing seriously wrong with them. These were not mistakes born of ignorance. By the early 1920s, the danger of radium to human tissue was not an unknown quantity within scientific and industrial communities. The company's chemists wore protective gear. Executives handling radium took precautions. But the young women in the painting rooms were told the paint was safe, were told to put it in their mouths, were given no masks, no protective clothing, no procedures to limit ingestion or inhalation. A 1924 internal study commissioned by the company found clear evidence that the workers were absorbing dangerous quantities of radioactive material. That study was not shared with the women. It was not shared with state health authorities. It was filed. 5 women, Grace Fryer, Edna Hussman, Catherine Schaub, Quinta MacDonald, and Albina Larice, eventually managed to find a lawyer willing to take their case. This was not straightforward. The stigma of the false syphilis diagnoses had followed some of them. The legal landscape surrounding occupational illness was poorly developed. The statute of limitations created an almost impossible barrier. Under New Jersey law at the time, legal action for personal injury had to be initiated within 2 years of the injury occurring. But the injuries from radium poisoning did not manifest visibly for years after the exposure began. By the time these women knew they were dying, and knew why, they were already legally too late. A lawyer named Raymond Berry took their case anyway. The legal battle that followed was not swift and triumphant. It was agonizing.
It stretched across months of depositions and delays, of corporate stonewalling and expert witnesses retained to confuse and obscure. Grace Fryer could no longer turn her head by the time the trial commenced. Her spine was compromised. She wore a metal brace. She had to be helped into the courtroom. The other plaintiffs were in similarly deteriorating states. Their bodies were failing in public, in front of a press that was now, finally, paying attention. A reporter named Walter Lippmann wrote about the case. The story made front pages. The phrase "Radium Girls" entered the public vocabulary, carrying with it
the weight that the company's legal strategy had failed to anticipate. The weight of visible human suffering in direct and obvious conflict with corporate denial. The case was settled in 1928. Each woman received $10,000 and an annual stipend for medical expenses, payments that would continue until their deaths, which, for several of them, were not far off. It was a modest settlement by any measure of justice, but it was something. It was acknowledgement. It was, in the cramped and inadequate language of legal settlement, an admission that something had been done to them. None of them fully recovered. Several died within a few years of the settlement. The radium in their bones did not leave when the check was signed.
Eben Byers was a wealthy American socialite who in 1927 began drinking a patent medicine called Radithor, essentially water containing dissolved radium and mesothorium, on the recommendation of a physician following a sports injury. He consumed roughly 1,400 bottles over the following years, believing enthusiastically in its restorative properties. By 1931, his skull had partially collapsed. His jaw was gone. Most of the bones of his skull had been destroyed. He weighed 92 pounds. A Wall Street Journal headline covering his death in 1932 read, "The radium water worked fine until his bones fell apart." The cultural love affair with radium ended, more or less, with Byers. His social prominence
made his death visible in ways the deaths of working-class women in New Jersey factories had struggled to be. But the Radium Girls had already done the actual work. The legal precedents established through their cases, the principle that employers bore responsibility for occupational disease caused by exposure to industrial materials, the right of workers to sue for damages beyond what workers' compensation might provide, the obligation of medical studies to be disclosed rather than buried. These were not abstract victories. They were the foundation of the modern framework of occupational health and safety law in the United States. Every regulation that governs how industrial chemicals are tested before workers are exposed to them, every requirement that employers disclose known hazards, every legal mechanism that allows a worker whose body has been damaged by her working conditions to seek remedy, these things exist in part because 5 women who could barely walk entered a New Jersey courtroom in 1928 and refused to accept that their suffering had no legal meaning. Dial painting with radium-based paint continued at the Ottawa, Illinois plant through the 1930s and into the 1940s, though under somewhat improved conditions and with somewhat greater precautions. More women in Ottawa were eventually diagnosed with radiation-induced cancers and bone disease. Catherine Wolfe Donahue, who could no longer walk and whose hip had fractured from the inside due to radiation damage, successfully sued the Radium Dial Company in 1938, testifying in a courtroom while lying on a stretcher. She died the following year. She was 34. The body of Catherine Donahue, along with those of several other Ottawa Radium Girls, was exhumed decades later as part of a study. The bones still registered significant radioactivity. 50 years after her death, the radium deposited in her skeleton during her years of factory work was still present, still measurable, still emitting. The half-life of radium is 1,600 years. She has been dead for less than 90. There is a photograph of Grace Fryer that has survived. She sits in a chair in a way that suggests the sitting is difficult, that the posture requires effort the body was not fully willing to give. She looks directly at the camera. Her expression is not one of suffering, exactly, though the suffering is present if you know where to look. It is something quieter than that.
Something that sits between endurance and exhaustion, and something that might, in a different context, be called determination. She died in 1933. She was 34 years old. Molly Maggia, Amelia's sister, who had also worked at the factory, died the same year as Amelia. Also young, also in the grip of the same quiet, glowing catastrophe. Irene Laporte, Helen Quinlan, Helen Munch. The names accumulate. Most of them are not widely known. Most of them exist now only in court records and death certificates, and the occasional footnote of a history that continues to undervalue the cost of what they endured and what they made possible. The undark paint was reformulated in the 1940s, replacing radium with tritium, and eventually with non-radioactive luminous compounds. The watches continued to glow. The girls who had made them glow were by then dead
Or dying, or spending the remainder of their compressed lives in the company of pain, and the particular bitterness that accompanies the knowledge that your suffering was preventable. The factory buildings in Orange and Ottawa have been remediated, most of them, though radioactive contamination in the surrounding soil persisted for decades. In some areas, it persisted long enough to become a slow horror for communities who moved into the neighborhoods surrounding former plant sites without knowing what lay beneath the topsoil. The radium does not announce itself. It does not glow visibly to the naked eye in soil or in the dark corner of a basement. It is quiet. It is patient. It is still in its way doing what it always did, emitting continuously from wherever it is settled. What happened to the Radium Girls was not an accident. This is the sentence that must be stated plainly, without equivocation, at the conclusion of everything else that has been said. What happened to them was not the consequence of ignorance alone, not the tragic result of an era that simply did not yet understand the physics of radioactive decay. Some of it was ignorance. Much of it was not. Decisions were made by men in positions of authority and financial interest who possessed information about the danger and elected to Manage that information rather than share it, who hired doctors to produce the verdicts they required, who permitted young women to put radium in their mouths thousands of times and said nothing, because saying something would have meant stopping something, and stopping something would have cost money. The mechanisms of that choice are not unfamiliar. They appear with different materials and different names and different decades stamped on the documents throughout industrial history. The pattern is recognizable. The calculation is the same. What is different about the Radium Girls is only what they did in response. They were sick. They were dying.
They were running out of time in the most literal possible sense. And they went to court anyway.
They found a lawyer and sat through depositions and endured the spectacle of being publicly characterized as contaminated and broken, and in at least one corporate strategy, morally suspect. The syphilis diagnosis was not accidental, and they did not stop. They did not stop because they understood that the case was not only about them, that the settlement they might not live to spend would create precedents that would protect women who would work in factories that had not yet been built, for companies that had not yet been formed, in industries that had not yet been imagined. They understood, or came to understand, that their suffering could mean something beyond itself if they were willing to spend what remained of their strength on making it mean something. That is not a small thing. It is, in fact, an extraordinary thing. It is the kind of thing that history often fails to adequately honor because it happened quietly in a courtroom in New Jersey, without armies or speeches or the drama that attaches itself to events large enough to be unambiguous. It happened in the bodies of women who glowed in the dark, who were told they were fine, who knew they were not fine, who refused to disappear without leaving something behind. They left behind the law. They left behind a framework of protection that their own suffering had purchased, that continues to govern the relationship between workers and the hazards of their labor to this day. And they left behind their names. Amelia Maggia, Grace Fryer, Catherine Schaub, Quinta MacDonald, Albina Larice, Edna Hussman, Catherine Donahue, Irene Rudolph, Frances Spletstocker, Helen Quinlan, Marguerite Carlo, Jane Stocker. Say them. Remember them.
Though they were victims, not as heroes, though they were heroic, but as women who were used, and who knew they were used, and who decided that the using would not be the final word. The watches they painted are still out there, in antique shops, in estate sale boxes, in the drawers of old houses where someone's grandfather kept the things he brought back from the war. If you hold one of those watches in a dark room, it may still glow. That glow has a cost. It was paid in full by someone whose name you may not know. It is time to know their names.